Hey, I'm so glad you could join us. I've certainly isn't the most ideal situation here having me film in my living room, but I'm glad that we're able to do this nonetheless, and I'm glad that we're able to have our weekly Zoom Bible studies on Wednesday nights, and I hope that you keep joining us as we're gonna talk more about what we're gonna be talking about this morning. Most of you know that I worked at this wilderness camp before coming to our church, and I keep thinking to myself that would be the ideal place to be right now, because you go to the store and they don't have like anything. You can't find canned goods, like people are just stocking up. But at the camp we had a big warehouse filled with canned goods that we would just eat, and so we would always say, if the zombie apocalypse ever happened, that's where we would be. There's clothes, there's tools, there's equipment, there's food, and food that lasts for a long time. There's mountains of toilet paper there. At one point, some people made a fort just out of canned corn. There's plenty of supplies there. So that would definitely be the place to be if the zombie apocalypse happened, and it probably wouldn't be too bad to be there right now with the way stores are. But when we were at the camp, every morning we would wake up and make our bed. We'd make our bed, and we make it very specifically. We do the military corners and folding it and tuck it in real nice, get the pillow perfect, and we wanted our beds to look good. And then we go on to the rest of our day. But we always wanted to start our day off making our bed. Some of you may have heard of the book Make Your Bed by Admiral McRaven. In that book, he says the best thing you can do to start your day is to make your bed. The reason is because no matter how the rest of that day goes, if it's a terrible day, if it's a hard day, if things aren't going your way, if there's disappointment and sadness, no matter what, at the end of the day, you can remember that you made your bed. And at the camp, we saw that play out, because there'd be days when it was hard. We're tired, we're frustrated. Some of the boys were acting up, and it just didn't go the way that we wanted to go. But at the end of the day, we could always go back into our cabins and see that our beds were made, and climb into bed and just have that satisfaction knowing that we did something well, and something was there, and something was good. Even in the midst of everything not going the way that we would have hoped. Even when everything wasn't working out, our beds were made. And so this morning, I want us to think about that in the midst of everything going on around us, in the midst of things not working out, friends disappointing us, bad leadership, good things happening, or bad things happening to good people, that there's one thing that is constant in there. And I want us to look at John chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 20 and move throughout the rest of the chapter. Last week we talked about verses 1 through 11 and Jesus getting arrested, and we talked about how Jesus was faithful and gave himself and sacrificed himself and was willing to do what God wanted to do rather than maybe what he wanted to do. Right? We talked about how, Jesus prayed, God, if it's your will, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And that was his attitude when he was in the garden, when the band of soldiers, when 300 to 600 soldiers and all the high priest guards and all came to arrest him. And so starting in verse 12 through 14, John is setting the scene here. John is setting the scene. He's letting us know that Jesus is arrested, and he's reminded of something that he's told us before. It says, so the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So Jesus is arrested, and John wants us to remember, he wants us to have a certain mindset going into the rest of this chapter, that this is leading up to Jesus' ultimate sacrifice for the sins of the world. This is leading up to that, and Caiaphas had actually said earlier in the book of John that it would be expedient that one should die for the people. And John wants us to remember that. He wants us to be reminded of what the big picture is going into this story. Because now we're going to see a couple different interactions going on during this trial of Jesus. Jesus is arrested, now he's put on trial. And there's a few interactions. We see Peter and the other people in the courtyard. We see the high priest and Jesus, and we see Jesus and Pilate. So let's look at the interactions with Peter here. We're going to read verses 15 through 18 and then jump down to 25 and read 25 through 27. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl, who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of the man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I'm not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. Then jump down to verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are also not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So here we see Peter denying Jesus. Peter knew that this would come. In chapter 13, Jesus actually told Peter, "Hey, before the rooster crows 3 times, you're gonna deny me." And he said, no, that's never gonna happen. That's never gonna happen. And yet Peter, as we've seen a couple times, even last week, that Peter just reacts to the situation. He's put on the spot and he goes into self-preservation mode. And that's what he does here. In fact, 3 different times in this passage, even though he knew the right thing to do, he knew to stand up and say, "No, I follow Jesus." He knows who Jesus is. He knows all these truths, and yet in that moment of self-preservation, he denies it. He says, "I am not." And Peter is Jesus's close friend, right? So there's like all of the disciples, all the people, the crowds that were following Jesus, all the who followed him, and then there was kind of the 12 apostles, and now there's even just 11, right? Because Judas had already left. And within those 11, there was 3, Peter, James, and John, who were kind of that close-knit circle with Jesus. And Peter was like really close to Jesus. You might even say that Peter and Jesus were like best friends. And Peter failed. He failed big time here. He denied Jesus, even though he knew the right thing to do. He knew to stand up and say, "No, I know who he is. I'm not ashamed of who Jesus is." But he says, "I'm not." He fails. Jesus's friend failed him in this moment. And while this conversation with Peter and the people in the courtyard is going on, Jesus is before the high priest. Let's look at 19 through 24. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who you have heard me what I had said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So here Jesus is before the high priest. He's before the leadership. He's before a leader in the community, someone that people look to lead them. And the high priest, his role was to point people to God. That's what the role was set up in the Old Testament. The high priest, Aaron's role as the first high priest was to point the people of Israel to God, and that's what had continued. But the problem is that's not what happened, because the high priest decided that their main focus was that I want the power. So many people in leadership just want power. They don't necessarily want, to do the role that they're supposed to be doing, which is exactly what the high priest here is doing. The high priest's focus is on the role. He wanted the authority, but he lost sight of the fact that the high priest is supposed to point the people to God, which is exactly what Jesus was doing. Jesus, his whole role, as we saw in chapter 17, was his motive was to point people to the Father. So the high priest should have been the first person to jump on board when Jesus came around. He should have supported Jesus. He should have recognized that when Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and life, no one comes to the Father except through me, the high priest should have been like, you need to listen to him. But the problem is the high priest wasn't doing that. The high priest was blinded by his own selfishness and his own pride. The role became the most important thing. The leadership was selfish. So far we've seen two interactions. We've seen Peter in the courtyard and Jesus in the high priest. And so far, friends have failed and leadership has been proven itself selfish. Lastly, we're going to see Jesus before Pilate. So let's look at 28 and we're going to read through the end of the chapter. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests had delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So Jesus goes before Pilate. He goes before the governor. And he goes before the governmental system, the Roman ruler in the area, and has a conversation with him. And the outcome of that conversation is, hey, Jesus didn't do anything wrong. Pilate questioned him. He asked him questions and talked to him and had a conversation with him, and he found no guilt in him. Jesus was an innocent man. But the problem is Pilate was afraid of an uproar. In the same account in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it mentions that Pilate was afraid of an uprising. He was afraid that the Jewish people who were outside his house were gonna rise up, and he didn't want to lose his authority. So again, we're seeing this selfish leadership in Pilate. But so he sees Jesus as innocent. But he ended up doing what the Jews wanted him to do. He looked at their custom and said, "You have a custom to release one person. Do you want to release this innocent man?" And they said, "No, release Barabbas, who was a convicted robber. He was guilty." So this justice system had failed, and the good thing was happening to the bad person, and the bad thing was happening to the good person. You've probably heard the phrase, bad things happen to good people. That's exactly what's going on here. This justice was corrupted. The justice system was corrupted. So throughout the whole trial of Jesus, we're seeing, that Jesus's friend had failed to be a good friend and a good disciple during this time. The local leadership, the high priest, was selfish and wanted the authority rather than do what was right. In contrast to what Jesus had done earlier in chapter 18 of choosing what God wanted to do rather than what was convenient and easy for him. And then the same thing for Pilate is that Pilate, you see that this justice system it sometimes failed us, that sometimes bad things happen to us even if we're doing the right thing and even if we're following God. And I'm sure you've experienced some of those things too. You've had friends that have failed you, asking for help. Last week I talked about my truck and how I didn't share my truck with people, and I was that friend who failed someone. Maybe you felt the effects of selfish leadership, of people who just wanted to have authority, and that was about it. Or maybe you've had that thought, why is all these, I'm trying to do the right thing, why are bad things happening to me? People will fail and disappoint us. Leaders will be selfish, and bad things happen to good people. And, sometimes that's just the reality of it. Why is this coronavirus going around? I can't really answer that question. Sometimes life doesn't work the way that we want it to go. Sometimes bad things are going on. Friends are failing us. The people that we are supposed to be able to look up to are bad examples to us. There's plenty of things that we could list of how we've seen, friends failing us, leadership being selfish, and kind of this unjust society, unjust culture around us, and people treating each other poorly. Yet what I want us to see, in spite of all of that, and in spite of, thinking about your own life and how, there's all these things that could go wrong, is there's one thing that's constant in this passage. There's one thing that never changes. It's Jesus. Jesus doesn't change. He's constant. He's faithful through this. He starts off in verse 11 saying, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And that has set a tone for the rest of chapter 18 here, that Jesus is faithful. He answers honestly and selflessly to the selfish high priest. He answers honestly and shows his innocence in spite of the guilty man being released with Pilate. And the great thing is that even though all these wrong things are happening, what Jesus is doing is ultimately he's going to right all the wrongs. He rights wrongs and he leads selfishly. He leads selflessly. He is the exact opposite of all of these things. He doesn't deny us when we're found in him. He leads selflessly. He looks at us and points us towards God. And he not only, he sees our guilt and makes us innocent. He gives us his righteousness, his holiness, and rights all of the sin in our life. He rights all of our wrongs. So when life is going crazy around us, when we have people around us who are failing us, when we have leadership, when we have people that we look up to and should be a good example for us, setting bad examples, and when we just are thinking, man, life is just not treating me fair here, the one place that we can look in the midst of all that is Jesus. We can look towards Jesus and see that he is constant, he's loving, and he is faithful in the midst of everything. And we'll see that even more as we jump in next week in chapter 19, where Jesus is actually delivered over to be crucified. And we see to the extent that he goes to be that constant, faithful, loving Savior in our lives. And so look towards Jesus. Right? Don't look towards friends. Sometimes friends failed us. Don't look towards leaders because sometimes they set bad examples. Don't even, look towards life and other leaders because sometimes things aren't going to treat us the way that maybe they should. Things aren't going to be treated, but we can always look towards Jesus and find hope and rest in him. And that's my prayer for us right now during this time. My prayer is that we can look towards Jesus and not look towards anything else, but we can look towards Jesus. Spend time in the Word, spend time in prayer, spend time journaling, having conversations with our families. I hope you're checking out, I'm sending out all of the families a daily family devotion time. Spend time together as a family. If you're not doing that, getting that, let me know. If you're not doing it, I'd encourage you to do that. There's plenty of opportunities to be looking towards Jesus in the midst of this time. I've had great opportunities now to read quite a bit. I've read like 3 or 4 books so far in the past 2 weeks, helping me to look towards Jesus more. So look towards Jesus during this time. He's loving, he's constant, he's faithful, even when everything else is falling apart around us. Father God, thanks for this this time. Thank you that your Son is faithful, that he's constant, that he's loving, and that no matter what happens around us, that we can find comfort and rest in him. Help that be so. In your Son's name, amen. Thank you for listening in. Just like last week on Wednesday, we're going to have a Zoom Bible study, 7 o'clock for middle school, 8 o'clock for high school. And I'd encourage you guys to do that. We'll email out all your parents the information to get connected into that. And, you want to read this passage on the youth group page on our website. You'll find a discussion guide similar to the one that we had last week with just some questions. I encourage you guys to do that before you join that call on Wednesday. I'm praying for you guys, and look towards Jesus during this time. He's constant, he's loving, and he's faithful.